About the deficit. The projection is it's going to be about 4 times what it was last year. Stan, let me start with you. Doesn't that trouble you? You're a taxpayer. Doesn't that worry you?
Yeah, actually, it doesn't. I know David and I are going to disagree a little bit about this in terms of the long term, but short term, it's exactly the right fiscal policy for what's currently going on. The issue is not what's happening now or how big the deficit is this moment. It's what's going to happen when the economy starts to turn around. If you heard the previous interview with Jared Bernstein, he said once the economy turns around, the administration is going to have to turn on not a dime, but on $1 trillion. That's what we have to be watching for, not what's happening currently.
All right, David, got any thoughts here?
Well, the problem is not the short-term deficits, because a lot of that is because of stimulating the economy or dealing with unprecedented bailouts. We need to do that, although there's been a lot of money wasted on that, quite frankly. The problem is the almost $50 trillion in off-balance sheet obligations that we have, unfunded Medicare obligations, unfunded Social Security. And by the way, those aren't being addressed in any meaningful way by so-called health care reform.
All right, so you're saying things are much worse than we're talking about. Professor Meyerman, I want to bring you into this. Are things much worse than we're even talking about? Those numbers are pretty staggering.
I think they are much worse. I agree that in the short term, the deficits are not a huge deal one way or the other, whether you think they're good or bad. The short term is not the issue. But the long-term issue with Medicare and Social Security is huge. It's probably even worse than the existing projections. The issue for the administration's health care reform is that it's not reform. It's not going to control costs in existing programs or the new programs. It's just more government health care. So that means the deficit situations are probably much worse than anybody's admitting right now.
Yeah, I think we have to keep in mind you can't reduce health care costs by expanding coverage. They're not taking on the tough issues. We have $38 trillion of unfunded obligations for Medicare already, and they want to expand coverage and just pay for it. When are we going to start taking steps that we can deliver on the promises we've already made?
Stan, what do you think here? Because, you know, there are folks out who say, you know, this is certainly a problem we have to deal with, health care, and that what we're talking about will eventually rein in some of those costs. I mean, already, you know, you have somebody go to the emergency room, it's going to cost a heck of a lot more than if they did some planning ahead of time to kind of prevent, you know, preventive care. I mean, what do you think here on this front?
Well, I mean, look, first of all, both David and Jeff are exactly right. We're talking about a longer-term issue, no one's really looking at the full cost of expanding coverage to 47 million additional people. But I am very skeptical about long-term budget forecasts. Long-term basically being past lunch tomorrow. You know, the world changes very, very quickly these days, and I just don't find I cannot get exercised over 40 or 50-year projections when we're going to have trouble just getting through this year. Admittedly, we have to look somewhat long-term. But when you talk past the next election, past the next 2 elections, there are going to be countless wars, foreign military problems, God knows what else that's going to pop up, natural disasters, and none of the projections we have currently mean much of anything past about 2 years
So wait,
from now.
we've got a chart that's actually looking at future deficit. You know, we show what happens from 2008 to 2009. There's a dramatic jump we all know about 4 times what it was in 2008. 2010, it's also a pretty ugly number. Here it is for our viewers, and this is kind of the growth. But as you look at it, something like 2015, the deficit, we start to see a big cut. Now, Stan, you're saying that you don't really trust these numbers?
Well, certainly 2015, you're talking about 2 presidential elections are just about from now. And you're talking about a projection that's based on current law, not on what's actually likely to happen. You know, you can do a straight line extrapolation like that. I just don't think it means that much. But let me be, you know, clear. I'm not saying don't worry about it. I'm just saying I can't get exercised about how big the numbers look 20 or 30 years from now, because I just don't believe that they're going to be accurate. It could be much worse or much better.
Well, let's talk about creditworthiness. The S&P downgraded the AAA outlook for the United Kingdom back in May. If you look at our deficits to GDP, debt to GDP, off-balance sheet obligations to GDP, foreign lending to GDP, savings to GDP, we're worse.
Right.
We're worse.
Than the UK.
We're worse
but David,
than the UK.
David, how come the bond market isn't responding to that?
Because we have home team bias, and because people are myopic. Very myopic, and so are markets.
Jeff, I want to bring you into this.
Yeah, if I can weigh in, I certainly agree that the long-term forecasts tend to be uncertain, but I think all of the biases in the process, all the biases in the politics are to understate how bad it's going to be. We do projections, say, of tax revenue from tax increases. By construction, the CBO is not allowed to take account of the dynamic response, so we always overstate how much tax revenue we're going to get from tax increases. We do have a pretty long track record of forecasting Medicare expenditures based on demographics and the rate of increase of health inflation. Those have been very stable and are easy to forecast, and we see that every time we forecast it, we're wrong on the low side. So yes, there's uncertainty, but I think we know which direction that uncertainty is going to get resolved.
Couldn't we also be understating what kind of growth we see going forward? You know, let's assume that the economy eventually is going to get back on track and we start to see growth. I mean, it's going to change the equation, isn't it going to? Won't it?
Sure it is, but in order to grow your way out of the federal financial hole, you would have to have double-digit real GDP growth every year for decades. It hasn't happened.
The hole that we're currently in.
The hole that we're currently in. I'm not talking about the deficit. I'm talking about the unfunded obligations. Look, President Obama was right when he said that we're going to have to make some tough choices on taxes, entitlement reform, budget controls. My question is, what's his plan to get us there?
Stan, you know, the president hasn't really talked. I mean, a lot of people I hear, the thing that does bother them is they're saying there is no plan to cut the deficit. There's no plan out there. I mean, we're not hearing much on that front.
Well, I mean, first of all, I would be shocked and surprised if the president was trying to muddy the political waters currently by talking about what he's going to do in 2 years or a year from now, you know, about the deficit. In other words, he doesn't have to propose a plan yet. He will do it probably in the next budget, which will come out next February. You know, let me just comment quickly on what David said. He's exactly right. We're not going to grow our way out of this. And what's going to happen is that the government's going to have to decide to stop doing some things. That is, it can't continue to do everything it's currently doing, expect to be able to raise taxes to pay for it, and for that to be politically acceptable. But understand what I'm saying. Some of the things the government's going to have to stop doing is going to be very difficult politically.
All right. Sit tight, everybody. Stan, Jeff, David, we'll be back in a moment. We're talking about the dangers of the deficit on Bloomberg Television. 20 minutes after, we're back.